Last week, we traveled up to Montpelier for a visit to the Statehouse and a check-in with some of our local legislators, and, as it turned out, with Governor Phil Scott and Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. It was crossover week, as it's known, where bills that originate in one chamber, either the House of Representatives or the state Senate, had to have completed their journeys through the relevant committees and have been voted on by the full chamber. Then they go over to the other side for more review and another vote. If they pass muster in both houses, then they go to the governor for a signature before becoming law. Sometimes the governor declines to sign, and then both houses have to vote to override the veto, which requires a 2/3 majority in both houses. Housing and educational finance were two of the big issues under consideration that week we were there, but debates were also happening around bills that would ban the sale of flavored e-liquids, nicotine products, and menthol-flavored tobacco products, another that would impose a new felony charge for repeated retail thefts, along with many others, such as one that would have given the Green Mountain Care Board oversight over drug prices, in a bid to make them more affordable. But the main center of action the day we got there was around the fate of the program set up to house homeless Vermonters in motels. 4 overnight shelters were to be set up, one of them initially in Bennington, to house those who would no longer qualify for a motel room. But there seemed to be a lack of coordination between the executive and legislative branches on how this would all work. We stopped in at the Senate Judiciary Committee's room, where State Senator Dick Sears of Bennington is the chairman, when he and Senator Brian Campion were discussing what was going on with Susan Allen, the editor of the Bennington Banner.
But as you know, it's difficult to get to Bennington from Brattleboro or Brattleboro to Bennington using public transportation, and there's no transportation provided. So if people from Bennington had to go to Brattleboro, and they could only be in the shelter from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., so they would have to do something during the day. So, this is, we pointed out to the administration that this is a problem, and it's like, do you realize there's a mountain between us? I know there's public transportation, but you can get to Wilmington from Bennington, and you can get from Wilmington to Brattleboro, but it might take you a full day to get there.
Yeah. Frankly, the rollout of the whole thing has been very disappointing. We learned, I think yesterday afternoon they tried to pull together a meeting of the delegation. Several of us were on the floor or in committees. So again, like Dick said, this is happening Friday. I wouldn't be surprised, of course, what we've heard from Dan Monks, but I'm sure the police department is concerned. I'm sure other agencies are concerned. I'm sure citizens of Bennington are concerned. That there's been no, again, sort of preparation for this.
We thought the budget adjustment took care of this issue. Unfortunately, the governor didn't sign the budget adjustment until yesterday, and so I don't know if that's why he didn't have it prepared or what the reason was. But I will say, the rumors are spreading. We saw a Facebook post that it was illegal immigrants that were going to be housed. It's not. It's people that are leaving the motel program who may go back in because of disability or other reasons.
Then it was upstairs to the office of the Speaker of the House, where Speaker Jill Krowinski was giving a press conference largely around the same topic.
Lastly, I am very worried about the administration's action regarding the exiting of 500 Vermonters from hotels. They are clearly not following legislative intent. I don't understand how the administration can negotiate an $80 cap for hotel rooms before the bill reaches the governor's desk, but at the same time, they couldn't work with folks in the program until the bill was signed. Lives are at risk. Communities are completely in the dark. This has to stop.
In the end, 4 shelters were set up for 1 week, open from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. for folks who were no longer able to stay in the motels, those deemed physically able and without a disability. Right now, that motel program is slated to terminate on June 30th, unless something changes. While all this was going on, we caught up with local state representatives Seth Bongartz and Kathleen James to hear their thoughts on housing and educational finance in particular.
In the short term, we can keep folks housed while we work on a long-term solution to modernize and update that motel emergency housing program. And that's for our homeless and most vulnerable Vermonters. In terms of affordable housing, it's going to be really important that the legislature find money in the budget, as we've committed to doing, to keep some of our important housing construction and creation programs going. That means funding for the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. That's the funding that then flows to housing developers like Shires all over the state to build housing for low-income Vermonters. And we have really important programs like VHIP and the Missing Middle program that also provide and create housing for that band of folks who are just above low income, what we call the missing middle. So it's a yes and, right? We house our homeless Vermonters. We fully fund the programs that we need to fund to build housing for low income and moderate income Vermonters. We make sure that we're loosening Act 250 in the places where it makes sense, while protecting our forest blocks and our working lands and our landscapes while limiting sprawl. So we do all of these things, not just one.
And just real quick, education finance, I know, is another complicated subject. Do you think the current education financing setup as it is now, is it viable long term? Are we just going through a blip where things got kind of out of whack?
I don't think it's viable long term. And I think that there's a pretty broad consensus around that. You know, the education funding system that we have in place right now is 20 years old. It dates back to the Brigham decision in the mid-90s. And you have to be willing to take a deep dive into the system and see whether it's really working. So we did some work last year to update the weights. That was important work. The 5% cap that we had in that bill didn't work, but the underlying work to update the weights was fundamentally sound. I think, however, now we need to take a broad look at how we fund our schools statewide and be willing to have some really hard conversations about an overhaul, basically.
What do you see as the eventual solution or a place that the state needs to get to in order to, sort of fully resolve, or at least get on the pathway to resolving the housing crunch that we're seeing in the state?
Well, there's a lot of pieces to it. We will not be able to spend our way out of the housing crisis. We were fortunate for the last few years to have the ARPA and infrastructure money that we had from the federal government to help us build infrastructure to accommodate housing. In some ways, that's one of the most important pieces. Having water and sewer available really helps get housing built. So the fact that we're able to put a lot of money into water and sewer across Vermont in different communities is a big step. The other is the money that we spent directly on housing. And we've got thousands of units in the pipeline as a result of that. But now the federal money is gone. I think we were overall really smart with the federal money and spent virtually all of it on one-time expenditures. But we did it in a way that was pretty targeted toward housing, so that was a really good thing. Now we're in a different world where the amount of money that we can put as a state into housing is going to be obviously a lot less than it was. We've put between those two things I was just talking about, we put nearly $1 billion in over the last few years. We're not going to do that anymore, obviously. And so we need to look at things like, what we're working on now in my committee, and what we worked on, pieces that we worked on over the last 3 years, this being the third year, are helping with regulatory reform, if you will. And we did some things over the last 2 years to help make it easier to build housing in downtowns. And using a baseball analogy, we hit singles with those, and they were targeted, infill development or helping to change, like require smaller lots in downtown areas with sewer and water and those kinds of things. That helps. This year, we're taking a bigger step with a bill that, again, we've been working on for the last, actually I've been working on it since summer. But for towns that have sewer and water and the appropriate regulatory apparatus within the community, is to say that you will be those parts of your communities that are served by sewer and water, and in towns that have all of those can check all the boxes. In a lot of towns, a number of towns will be able to do that. They would be what's called under the bill a 1A town, and those areas will be exempt from Act 250. And so one of the several factors for the cost of housing is regulation. That's not going to help with the cost of labor, the cost of materials, but we're doing the things we can do to help, check off a couple of the boxes to make it easier to build housing. And in the smaller towns, the so-called, what will be now called the 1B towns, remember those two lines, 1A and 1B, because you're going to hear them for the next 20 years if this bill passes. The 1B towns will be those that have either sewer or water or appropriate soils that can handle a community system. And those towns they have planning, zoning, subdivision regulation, pretty basic though, requirements in those smaller towns. They'll be the so-called 1B towns, and for there, up to 50 units of housing will be exempt.
Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman also made time for an extended interview, which will air in a separate segment. The conversation we had with Governor Phil Scott has already been airing on our channels and on our website. The Statehouse is a special place, one that hums with activity when the legislature is in session. It's still a place where anyone can walk in, and it won't be long before you can find one of your representatives and share what may be on your mind. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.